Hi, welcome to the Integration Best Practices video series. This is video number 4 for Outbound Web Services. I'm David Gatley, the Senior Certification Engineer on our Certified Integration Program team. And with me I have John Anderson, our Solution Architect for the pre-sales team.
Hello folks. Hello David.
Today we're going to pick up where we left off on the last video and really round out our integration here. So to date, we have an integration, if you've been following the previous videos, that utilizes both a data source and a web service to bring in third-party data into our ServiceNow instance. We're using that data and bringing it into an application that exists within ServiceNow, our internet research application. We're bringing that data in through an import set and then transforming that data to our target table in our internet research application. Now we're going to focus on one last piece, which is getting data from ServiceNow back to our third-party database. So to do that, John's going to walk us through consuming an outbound web service, specifically a REST message from ServiceNow. We're going to talk about some business rules associated with doing that and how to construct those. We're also going to demonstrate the integration as it returns data back to our third-party database. And finally, we'll wrap that together by determining which parts of that web service call we want to wrap into our integration. So with that, John, would you like to walk us through how to create this outbound web service?
You bet. Thank you, David. So David, as you mentioned, we have this internet research application within ServiceNow that we're building an integration around. In this part of the integration, up till now in the video series, we've handled Acme Research Company pushing data to us, giving us users that we're pulling from them, and then as they find research, they're pushing that to us through a web service that we created. Now what we want to do is a reverse trip. Essentially, if we get research data from Acme Research and it's not really applicable, we decide that research item they don't need to waste their time on that. We can set this not applicable state, and if we do that, we want to push this not applicable state out to Acme Research so they know not to spend their time on that. So we're going to build that out today in this video series. Before we do that, we need to understand that Acme Research has a REST-based API that we're going to consume. And typically when we're doing a bidirectional integration such as this, we are usually using web services. Within ServiceNow, there are two protocols that we support for outbound web services. The first is SOAP. We can consume SOAP endpoints. All we need to have is a WSDL URL or a WSDL document, and we can auto-generate SOAP-based message templates that can consume those documents. Or in our case, ServiceNow can also support REST-based web services. REST web services, with that you just need to know the endpoint URLs and the structures that are used in that web service and build out the requests for your put, your post, and your get, and your delete functions if those are applicable. So we're going to use these templates today as we develop this round-trip communication. But before we get ahead of ourselves, another thing we're going to do is we need something to trigger off this integration, something that tells us, okay, we need to communicate with Acme Research. And as I mentioned before, what we want that trigger to be is when this state changes to not applicable, that's when we want to trigger this. In this type of integration where we have a trigger based off of a form change, we're going to leverage a technology called business rules. So if we were to look at this research item record and we would say personalize business rules, we would create a new business rule on this table. Business rules essentially are rules that watch table activity or record activity on a table. We're just going to call this one Acme Research not applicable. And with some business rules, there's different types of business rules, different types of settings for business rules. One of the most important settings, David, is when to execute this business rule. And we have a lot of options available to us. In this case, we're interested if these records are updated. So this is a record that is given to us by the third party. If this record is updated, then we want to see if the update contains the state change of not applicable. Also, for what we're going to do, we're going to jump into advanced because we're not just setting values, we're going to interact with some web services and everything. So I'm going to click this advanced button as well. That gives us a few more options. Another option that's important is this when field. Before means that the change has not yet taken place to the form. So the changes that are going to be made are cached into a variable but have not been saved yet to the form. After means the changes have actually been saved to the form, to the database. This is still server side, so anything that you're doing in an after business rule still holds up that user form until that script is done. So you still need to be careful with after business rules. Asynchronous business rules, what they do is this happens after the form has been saved and the form has been given back to the user. This just schedules a script or this business rule to happen anytime we have a free resource. So there's different times where we want to use these settings. Usually we'll use a before if we need to do some calculations or modifications and change the data on that form or record before it refreshes and presents itself back to the user. That's typically when we'll use a before. After, we'll typically use if nothing really on the form is going to change, but the work that we're going to do happens after the form is changed. Maybe we're going to interact with another system or another table and set values on another table, but we're not setting values on this table. Then we'd probably use an after in that case. Asynchronous, you'll usually use this if your form is not going to change and you're going to trigger off a script that maybe will just interact with a third-party system but doesn't necessarily need to provide feedback back to that form. So this means go ahead and save the record as if there's no business rule on this. So for the user experience, it's very quick. But when we have a free resource, we're going to execute this script and send data to this third-party resource. You do have to be careful with asynchronous business rules just because this is after the database action has happened. And while the asynchronous business rule will cache different field data that was set, it will not capture certain data such as journal entries, so comments or work notes, or journal entries such as that are lost to you in asynchronous. Also with the asynchronous, you don't get the previous values of the form available to you either. So you can't use asynchronous in all cases, but in our case, well, we're not going to change anything to the form. Once it saves, and when we get a free resource, we just want to update Acme Research to let them know that we're not interested in that research item. So in this case, I am going to use an asynchronous business rule. Now let's jump over to the condition and the script that we're going to execute. So in this case, I'm going to click down here. We can see the fields that are associated to that research item table. And we wanted the trigger to be a change in that state field. So I'm going to copy this and move it to our condition. And I'm going to say when the state changes to and not applicable. So when the state changes to that not applicable value, that's what's going to kick off this script. Right now we're not going to do anything yet because we don't have the other parts set up. I'm just going to say to do. So for right now we're just going to submit that. We really don't do anything at this point. What we need to now do is go ahead and set up that REST request that we need to make to Acme. So we're going to jump over to our navigation pane and choose REST. We'll go to REST message, and we'll create a new REST message. Now, Acme Research gave me their REST API documentation. I'm going to name this Acme Research. I'm going to give this a description that we're going to set the state of the research item in Acme system. And the REST endpoint that they gave me is, and it does require basic authentication, and they gave me a user. Submit this REST message record. What the system is going to do is it's going to auto-generate the standard REST functions that are associated with REST web services. For this API, since we're going to do an update, it's actually a post for them, and we're going to pass in our credentials. And then the REST API requires a JSON body. The first parameter is an ID field, and I'm just going to copy one of the IDs that they've already sent to us, and this will be our correlation ID field in our research item record. And then we need to set what the state value is going to be, and so not applicable for them is state number 5. So we'll send that value to them. So let's go ahead and save this. And one other thing we need to do, David, is I almost forgot, we do need to set the appropriate headers. So we need to set an accept header. And we also need to send a content type header. All right, now let's go ahead and give this a test. And this is the response that we get back from the system. If they've received our state change request, we get a success back. Let's go ahead and set this up so that we can consume this in a script. Obviously, what we've done is hard-coded this. There's a few things that we need to do to make this configurable a little bit. So first of all, this is just a test system. So what we're going to do is make a variable out of this rather than force them to come to this base URL. We're just going to do a variable, and we'll just call this one base URL. We'll also want to set the ID as a variable as well. We'll call this variable correlation ID, since this will be the correlation ID. Now we'll go ahead and save that. Okay, so now we have some variables that we can leverage to make this script a little bit more flexible. I've also gone and entered in those variables with some sample data here under our REST message function parameters, so that I can just click this preview script usage link and generate the code required to post that web service request. So I'm going to copy this code and exit out of here, and let's jump back to our business rule. We'll go into our script area, and let's paste our code here. This is going to post the data out to our third-party system, but we'll want, instead of hard coding this value here, we'll want to take the correlation ID from the current form that's being saved and pass that in so that it's setting the correct record. Also, another thing I'm going to do is I'd like to make this a property so that our customers just have one place to come. They can come to this settings page and set this property and not have to worry about going to that REST message record to set this. So I'm going to cut that, and what we'll do instead is we'll do a gs.get property, and our property prefix, I believe, was jja.integration.acmeresearch, and I think I capitalized these, and Acme Research, and we'll just call this base URL. And then also we'll want that the authentication, you know how we had to put in a username and password in that REST message. We want to move that to our configurations page as well. So let's just create a username variable. We'll do the same with the password. Okay, and then authentication, the REST message function has a function called setBasicAuth. So we're just going to call that r.setBasicAuth. We're going to pass the username and password into that. That way we don't rely on those field settings within the REST message record. And let's go ahead and save this. Now we need to go and create those 3 properties that we're referencing. So let's go do that. To that, we're going to jump to our settings categories page that we created with that wizard back in video 1, and we'll create some new properties. I'm just going to copy the old property string to make it quick, but I'll do a new property, and we'll call this one base URL. And we'll say the REST endpoint base URL.
John, I think you may need to capitalize the L.
Oh, thank you very much for capturing that. Okay, and then we'll put a default value in there, and we'll go ahead and submit that. And then we'll want to create the username and password values as well. So we'll click New. Username, and for now we'll just do that default value. Then we'll create the password property, and we'll set this to be a password 2. Right now we're just going to type in a fake password because we'll just do a blank password, because you don't want to capture the password value in your update set because it won't apply to everyone. So we'll just leave it blank, and we'll turn off the update set when we want to really set the passwords. So,
John, what is the difference between the password 1 and the password 2 type?
The password 1 type is a one-way hash. That means we can't ever get the value of the password. Password 2 is an encrypted hash that the system can decrypt on the fly when it makes this web service request. So password 2 is the appropriate one to use on the web service requests. All right, and then let's go ahead and order these, David. We'll make sure our base URL is at the top, and then username we'll do next, along with password, and verbosity we're going to move just to the end, so we'll give it 100. Then let's just check that out on our settings page. And here's our updated settings page. Here's our REST endpoint and our API, and I've turned off the I'll turn off the update set, and we'll set the real password up here, and we'll hit save. Then we'll jump back, and we need to set our update set once again, and we'll jump back into our business rule. And with our business rule, what I'd just like to do, it's mostly we'd probably do a little bit more with it than what we're doing for this demo, but we're just going to log the response to that web service, just to the system log, using our custom logger. So I'm going to initiate our Acme log helper library here, and I'm going to do acme.log REST response. And we're going to take response.getBody. And we'll go ahead and save this. So let's go ahead and test this out, David, just to see if I coded this properly. Let's jump to the Internet Research application, and we'll look at all the external research items. Right now there's just one. We'll go into it, and what should trigger the integration is us moving this to not applicable. So we'll move that to not applicable and click Update. And notice how fast that was despite us making a web service call. That's because this was an asynchronous web service business rule, or an asynchronous business rule. And behind the scenes, whenever it gets time, it's going to execute that web service call and update Acme. So let's jump over to our integration application, and let's look at the output log, since we used our own logging mechanism. And as you can see, we did get the status success. So we could build some logic around that to do something else. But for this demo, that's just enough to show that we did make that connection, and Acme now knows that we've changed that state to not applicable. One more thing I do want to mention on business rules that I didn't mention before, and this isn't necessarily only an integrations best practice, this is a ServiceNow platform best practice. But there is a concept of global business rules. So instead of selecting a table, you can select global, and that just becomes a global script. These are quite dangerous. You have to know how to really set these up so that they don't interfere with other libraries and other scripts, as well as consume resources. So this for years has been a best practice. We do not want you creating global business rules. If at all possible, and seldom do you ever need to. For our integration, we're going against that research item table, so this would not be a global business rule anyway. But I just did want to bring up that important fact about global business rules for best practices. So there we have it, David. What we've succeeded in doing is create a round trip back to Acme Research on a very particular trigger point, that state changing. Not only that, but we've captured the REST API for Acme, and anything that was configurable with that REST call, we've moved to our settings page so that our users, whoever uses this update stat, still has one place to go to set up the information for those REST messages and not have to worry about jumping into any REST message record to make those changes. Anyway, I'll turn it back to you, David.
All right, that's fantastic, John. I think we have a great bidirectional integration now, and we're ready to really wrap this up and possibly submit it for certification in our certified integration program. Just to recap what we saw today, John made that great point about the global business rules. We do not want to use global business rules when possible. So setting those to the tables that you're working within is really the best practice to follow here, and avoiding global business rules at all costs is really what we're looking for. Additionally, we saw the difference between before, after, and async business rules and how that impacts performance and response times for both ServiceNow and that third-party recipient of this web service call.
And just to interrupt here, David, we went over that part really quickly. This is not a how-to video as much as just a best practices video. I believe the wiki documentation on business rules explains each of those in more detail, and also outlines what variables are available to you in those states. So
yeah, absolutely. I think for any of these points that we might be breezing over in terms of a how-to, definitely check out the wiki for more in-depth details and a more leisurely pace at your own pace for creating and setting up a lot of these items. And then the third point that was really worth noting from a best practice standpoint is when you are configuring that outbound web service, avoiding hard coding as many of those parameters as possible and really providing a configurable settings page is the best way to go. It makes this a really user-friendly type of integration and something that we can modify with relative ease as we extend this integration moving forward. So that wraps up video number 4, our Outbound Web Services video. Be sure to check out the upcoming videos on the integration certification program, so how we take a completed integration of this nature and submit it for certification within the program. Additionally, keep an eye out for video number 5 in the series, which is exporting data from ServiceNow and the best practices around that step as well.